Hey everyone, I'm Philip J. Rutherford, and this is the first deluxe reading from my recent book, Hydrosphere Rising. These readings include GPS maps, weather conditions, notes and access history from the mini-screen device owned by Owen Pilgrim, the main character, plus artists' renditions of the 22nd century coastline. The story begins in a place called Bundina, south of Sydney in Australia. Before sea level rise took off, it was a village on the edge of the Royal National Park, and this is an artist's rendition of what it looked like in the year 2020. It was a popular recreation area with beautiful beaches, eucalypt forests, and a camping area on the waterfront. Now this is a rendition of Bundina 100 years later, in April 2120, when Owen visited it. It was no longer a village, but was simply known as Bundina Bay. Owen had taken his jet ski to an area just west of Bundina, and that is where the narrative begins. Hydrosphere Rising, Chapter 1. Owen lay on his back in the water, watching the dark clouds move quickly above. The usual afternoon storm was on its way, but that was okay. He enjoyed the rain. He pulled himself up with his arms and sat on the rock platform. With his feet dangling in the water, he used one hand to sweep back the dark fringe from his face, and immediately he felt the chill of the wind on his wet skin. This was his favourite part of the bay. The bush of the national park curved around in front of him, hugging the wide lagoon, and behind him were the sandstone caves he had camped in many times, their ceilings blackened by numerous campfires. His grandfather had first brought him here when he was 7 and told him many stories as they sat warming themselves by the fire, drinking hot chocolate boiled in a metal can. He still remembered the smoky taste. Now he was 18 and still enjoyed coming here, as it reminded him of happier times, times before his world had fallen apart. He looked down at the water and saw the first few heavy drops of rain. They hit the smooth surface, causing ripples to spread out and cross over. The sunset reflecting from behind created a Van Gogh painting of yellowy oranges, and Owen felt a deep calm settle over him. He loved the rain on the water and drank in the damp, earthy smell of rain on the surrounding bush. After a while he felt too cold, so he jumped down off the rock into the ocean, and it was like a warm bath. Sinking down into the warmth with his back against the rock platform and his chin level with the water, his body relaxed, but the cold air on his face kept him alert. The sound of the raindrops as they hit the surface was comforting, and even though he was outside, he felt somehow cosy and sheltered by the ocean that enveloped him. Floating like this, he almost forgot the knot in his stomach and the tightness in his chest that had plagued him for the past year. The constant exhaustion that usually kept him in his bedroom also seemed to be diluted by the buoyant liquid. The downpour became heavy, and the sunset painting on the surface was quickly erased as sheets of rain moved across it. The water looked like it was boiling now, and the sound of it was all around him. He paused for a moment, soaking it in, and then pulled his goggles on, plus his snorkel, and dove down into the silence and coolness. In the last rays of the sun that penetrated the water, he could make out the shapes of roads and fences below him. The sea level, having risen at least 5 metres in the last 100 years, had flooded this place, which had once been a holiday park on the edge of the Royal National Park south of Sydney. His grandfather told stories of how he had camped here when he was a boy. Owen imagined he was a bird flying over the roads and tracks where his grandfather had ridden his bicycle, over the trees his grandfather had climbed, and over the wood-fired barbecues where his grandfather had cooked dinner. Everything was covered with barnacles and seaweed that slowly swayed in the current, giving it a ghostly appearance. He flew over the toilet block that was now home to many small fish, and beyond that, spreading out below him, was the vast mudflats, where his grandfather had chased swarms of soldier crabs. Of course, there were now many jellyfish due to the ocean becoming more acidic, and huge clouds of them floated like flocks of birds around him. The entire scene was very dim in the failing light, and he could not make out any fish swimming over the plain. Suddenly, everything was lit by a brilliant flash. Owen could not hear the crack of thunder because his head was under water, but he knew it was there. The storm was turning nasty, which was strange because there had been no thunderstorm on the forecast. He quickly poked his head out of the water into a scene of chaos. The rain was coming horizontally now, and enormous waves were rolling across the bay, the wind whipping them into whitecaps. His electric jet ski was bucking dangerously about 20 metres away. Flooding hell, he thought, and struck out for it immediately. When he arrived out of breath, he pulled himself up onto the seat and pressed the start button. The machine shot away across the bay, but he could not hear the usual whine of the engine above the storm. With the jet ski at top speed, each wave launched him into the air. This happened every few seconds, and he had to keep his goggles on to see where he was going. Luckily, he had managed to salvage some nanotech self-cleaning goggles, so he could see all too clearly that this was no ordinary storm. A giant wave crashed into his side and nearly flipped the jet ski, but Owen held on. He swallowed a huge amount of salt water, and the sting of it went up his nose. Somehow, he pushed through the breaking waves and arrived at his family's jetty, frozen and shaken, only to discover that his problems were just beginning. One of his family's salvage boats had broken its moorings and was being swept away into the bay. It was about 50 metres from the rocky headland that would smash it to pieces. Owen's parents were away and had left him in charge. It was up to him alone to save the family's livelihood. "I am so in trouble," he shouted, and gunned the jet ski towards the runaway boat, his words ripped away by the wind. This storm shouldn't be happening. The forecast was for a normal afternoon rainstorm. Otherwise the boats would have been in their storm shelter. When he reached the boat, it was 40 metres from the rocks. He leaned down into the water, grabbed one of the ropes that the boat was dragging, and tied it to the back of the jet ski. Then he turned the throttle up full, and the rope stretched tight between the two vehicles. The water was churning behind him, and he could feel the engine vibrating violently under his legs, but they were still drifting towards the rocks. The jet ski wasn't powerful enough. "This isn't going to work." He couldn't start the boat's engine because he didn't have the key with him. But he had to do something. He brought the jet ski alongside and jumped, scrambling aboard just before another wave hit. A few more seconds and the boat would be on the rocks, but he had installed the 500 kilowatt electric engine himself and knew every inch of it. He ducked into the cockpit, where the dry and quiet was a strange contrast to the howling wind and rain outside. Owen fumbled with his wet hands underneath the helm and pulled out a mess of wires. The rocks were looming out the window next to him, only metres away. He yanked 2 of the wires off their terminals and twisted their metal together. There was a roar of power, and he was thrown back onto the floor as the boat surged forward. Fortunately, the boat had been pointing in the right direction, away from the rocks, and it was now out of danger. Owen couldn't believe it. It actually worked. As he pulled the throttle back to slow the boat down, his heart was still racing, but he felt an immense relief. "That was a close one," he said as he steered the boat back to the jetty with the jet ski in tow. He winched the boats up into the storm shelter and locked the carbon fibre door tightly. His parents were only involved in legal salvage operations, so they weren't rolling in money or anything. Even though occasional spoils such as nanotech goggles came their way, they definitely couldn't afford to lose a whole boat. Tonight had been a very lucky escape, and with the way the storms were these days, you had to be lucky just to survive. Owen trudged up to the house, exhausted. The single-storey bungalow squatted low behind a small hill of earth that had been heaped up to protect it from storms. He entered the hallway dripping and went straight to the bathroom for a hot shower. Afterwards, still toweling his hair, he said to the empty room, "Joe, weather forecast, please." A person appeared on a large screen in the room, but his voice was barely audible over the sound of the rain blowing on the windows. The room was lit only by a couple of lamps, and one showed water drops splashing inside under a window which was open a crack. Owen walked over and could smell the rain on the leaves outside as he shut the window. "Volume up, please, Joe." The man on the screen was saying, "This is the 5th unpredictable mini-cyclone this year. Since the advent of superstorm weather patterns, the frequency of unpredictable cyclones has been steadily increasing." This was nothing Owen hadn't heard before. About 50 years ago, fresh water from the melting Greenland and Antarctic ice sheets stopped the circulation currents in the ocean that moved heat from the equator to the poles. Since then, the poles had been getting colder and colder, while the equator was getting warmer and warmer. This had created huge superstorms driven by the temperature difference, with wind speeds in excess of 400 kilometres per hour. It also made it bloody hard to predict the weather. He sank back into the couch and peeled the lid off a self-heating meal pack, letting the weather charts, statistics, and the virtual presenter's soothing voice wash over him. As soon as he broke the seal on the foil container, it started to warm, and before he realised it, it was burning his fingers. He dropped it onto the couch. "Storm it!" Luckily nothing spilled, and the smell of plant meat spaghetti bolognese filled his nostrils, making his mouth salivate. When he finished eating, he was so tired he dozed off where he sat. After half an hour, the lights in the living room went off automatically. Later that night, he woke up on the couch and realised that the wind had stopped. He fell asleep again to the soft drip, drip of the rain. He had no idea that tomorrow would change his life forever. That's the end of chapter 1. If you enjoyed it, please hit the like button, and also remember to click subscribe so you don't miss chapter 2, which will be coming real soon. Thanks for listening, and look forward to seeing you next time.